Emma had always been the steady kind of woman, grounded, patient, and deeply loyal. When she met Daniel, he was 27, and full of a restless charm that drew her in instantly. He wasn't the type to sit still for long. He loved speed, risk, and the rush of living life a little too close to the edge. She was 25 then, and in her eyes, his recklessness was simply another form of bravery. Their marriage came quickly, almost impulsively, but Emma believed in love that leapt before it looked. For a while, life with Daniel felt like a promise fulfilled. They lived in a small rented house on the outskirts of town, where evenings were quiet and mornings began with shared coffee and half-dreamed plans about a future they couldn't quite afford yet. Everything changed on a rainy night in early autumn. Daniel, against Emma's pleas, had taken his motorcycle out for a ride after dinner. He said he needed the wind, the noise, the feeling of motion. She had gone to bed with a lingering unease in her chest, only to be jolted awake hours later by the ringing phone. The voice on the other end belonged to a police officer, flat and urgent, telling her there had been an accident. Oil spilled on the wet road had turned the asphalt into a trap. Daniel's bike had slid out from under him, and his body had slammed into a roadside barrier with crushing force. At the hospital, Emma was met with the cold smell of antiseptic and the rhythmic hiss of machines keeping Daniel alive. His injuries were severe: fractured vertebrae, nerve damage, and a head wound that had left him unconscious for days. When he finally opened his eyes, the man she loved was still there, but he could not move from the chest down. The doctors were careful with their words, explaining that recovery would be long, uncertain, and incomplete. Some never walked again after injuries like his. Emma refused to see this as the end. She brought him home as soon as the hospital would allow, turning their modest living room into a makeshift care ward. She learned how to change dressings, administer injections, and monitor for bed sores. Nights were sleepless, punctuated by the sound of him calling her name in pain. She learned to turn him gently every few hours, to feed him when his hands refused to work, to hide her exhaustion behind a soft smile. Money drained faster than she could earn it, so she took on extra shifts at the diner, coming home with aching feet to a man who could barely lift his own. Months blurred into years. She sold her gold wedding bangles to cover physiotherapy sessions, believing every step forward, however small, was worth the sacrifice. She found ways to keep his spirits alive, placing fresh flowers by the bed, reading him stories, playing his favorite music on an old speaker. Sometimes he would watch her quietly, and she would imagine gratitude in his eyes, though he rarely said the words. The strain was constant, but so was her determination. Slowly, against the odds, his body began to respond. Fingers twitched, muscles strengthened, and one day he managed to stand with support. It was a victory they celebrated privately, their laughter echoing in the cramped room. From there, progress came in uneven waves. A step one day, two the next, then a week of frustration when his body seemed to betray him again. Still, Emma held firm, believing that love meant enduring the worst as well as the best. 3 years after the accident, Daniel stood unaided in their living room, his face pale with effort, but lit with triumph. Emma felt tears burn her eyes, thinking of the nights she had prayed for this moment. She believed they had survived something that would have broken other couples. She believed they had been tempered by hardship, made unshakable by shared suffering. What she didn't see, what she couldn't see, was the shift beginning in his heart. The man who had once clung to her for life was no longer looking at her with the same warmth. The gratitude she had expected was replaced by something she could not yet name. For Emma, this was the end of a long and grueling chapter. The moment she thought they could finally breathe again. For Daniel, it was the quiet beginning of a darker path she could never have imagined. Daniel's recovery was supposed to bring them closer, but as the weeks passed, Emma began to feel something shifting between them. At first, it was small and easy to overlook. A missed smile, a curt response, a sudden disinterest in the quiet routines they had once shared. She assumed it was the aftershock of everything he had been through, the frustration of relearning simple movements and living with lingering pain. But as his strength returned, so did a restlessness that unsettled her. It was as if regaining his independence had opened a door in his mind to a world where she no longer belonged. He started spending more time outside the house, claiming he needed fresh air or to meet friends he hadn't seen in years. The man who had once been content to sit by the window with her, drinking tea and watching the street, now left for hours without explanation. Emma would find herself staring at the clock, trying not to worry, convincing herself he deserved the freedom after being trapped in a bed for so long. Still the unease grew. Subtle changes crept into his habits. He began paying more attention to his appearance, buying new clothes, styling his hair with meticulous care. There were new colognes on the dresser, scents Emma had never smelled before. When she asked about the extra expenses, he brushed off her questions with vague answers. She told herself it was harmless, that he was simply reclaiming his old life. Deep down, though, she knew something had altered between them. Nights that used to end in quiet conversation now passed in silence. He stopped sharing the small details of his day, details that had once been their connection. Emma, tired from work, tried to fill the gaps with stories of her own, but his eyes would wander, his mind clearly elsewhere. The warmth she had fought so hard to preserve during his recovery seemed to be slipping away. Emma also noticed a flicker of resentment in him. It was strange and unspoken, but it was there, an edge to his voice when she reminded him of the physiotherapy appointments, or when she mentioned the years they had spent fighting for his health. He avoided talking about the accident entirely, almost as if those years were a chain he wanted to cut away rather than a bond they had shared. Friends who visited commented on how well he was doing, how incredible it was that he had recovered. He would smile and nod, accepting their praise, but rarely mentioned Emma's role in his healing. She told herself she didn't need the recognition, but the omission stung more than she expected. It was during this time that his phone became another wall between them. He guarded it closely, tilting the screen away from her, stepping outside to take certain calls. Text alerts came late at night, and he would read them with a faint smile before turning the phone face down on the table. Emma's instincts told her there was something behind it, but she forced herself not to ask. She had carried him through his darkest years. She wanted to believe that meant something. The atmosphere in their home grew heavier. Meals were eaten in near silence, the television filling the space where laughter had once been. She tried to plan small outings, thinking it might help them reconnect. But he always had an excuse: too tired, too busy, or already committed to something else. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed energized in ways that didn't involve her. He returned home at odd hours, smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers. He kept certain receipts hidden in his wallet, and once Emma found a shopping bag tucked away in the back of the closet, holding a dress far too small for her size. She placed it back where she found it, heart pounding, unwilling to face what the truth might be. The man she had once believed would never leave her side seemed to be slowly, deliberately drifting away. Every act of care she had given over those 3 years, every sleepless night, every extra shift, every sacrifice, was fading into the background of his new life. She didn't yet know the full extent of his distance, or the depth of the betrayal forming in the shadows, but she could feel it. Daniel, now fully able to walk without help, carried himself with the air of someone who had shed an old skin. He no longer seemed bound to the woman who had kept him alive. In his mind, the years of dependence were an anchor, and Emma was the one holding the chain. By the time she realized how far he had already gone, the damage was done. The connection they had once shared had become a fragile, hollow thing. What Emma didn't yet know was that his restlessness was not just about escaping the past. It was about making room for someone else entirely, someone younger, someone who would become the catalyst for the cruelest turn her life would ever take. Daniel first noticed Lily on an afternoon, when he was walking through the neighborhood, something he had started doing more frequently since regaining his mobility. She was sitting on the steps of a friend's porch, laughing in the kind of carefree way that felt foreign to him after years of illness and recovery. At 18, she carried herself with a lightness he found intoxicating. No history of sacrifice weighing her down, no quiet reminders of a time when he had been helpless. Their first conversation was brief, almost accidental, but it left him thinking about her long after he had walked away. From that day, he found reasons to cross paths with her. Sometimes it was at the corner store, other times at the park, where she liked to sit with a paperback and an iced drink. Lily knew of him in a vague way. She had heard he'd been in an accident and made an incredible recovery. To her, he was older, confident and mysterious. To him, she was a spark, something new that made the years with Emma feel like a faded photograph. At first, their meetings seemed innocent. They talked about music, movies, and places they wanted to visit. But Daniel's interest in her grew quickly. He began buying her small gifts, things she hadn't asked for but always accepted with a shy smile. He told himself it was harmless, just attention from someone who appreciated him without the shadow of his injury hanging over every word. Back at home, Emma had no idea who Lily was. She assumed Daniel's absences were tied to old friends or errands he didn't care to explain. He kept his phone locked, his tone cheerful when she asked where he'd been, careful never to raise suspicion. But his feelings for Lily deepened with each passing week. The contrast between her youthful energy and Emma's quiet weariness became, in his mind, impossible to ignore. He started to imagine what life with Lily would look like, a life unburdened by the past 3 years, one where he didn't have to be reminded daily of his weakest moments. As the month passed, the secrecy became a thrill. They began meeting in places far from home, cafes in other neighborhoods, quiet spots by the lake where no one knew them. Lily's friends teased her about the age gap, but she dismissed their concerns, caught up in the attention and gifts Daniel provided. He spoke to her about starting over, about living somewhere else, somewhere exciting. She didn't ask many questions about Emma, and Daniel offered little information. At home, Emma noticed changes she could no longer ignore. He was more guarded, distracted even when they were in the same room. She found receipts for expensive dinners she hadn't attended, and saw a sudden drop in their bank balance. When she asked about it, he claimed he was repaying old debts. She wanted to believe him, wanted to avoid the possibility that the man she had carried through the darkest years of his life was betraying her. Daniel, meanwhile, began to see Emma as an obstacle. He no longer viewed her as the woman who had saved him, but as a reminder of a version of himself he despised. Lily represented escape youth, freedom, and a chance to rewrite his story without the baggage of his injury. The more he imagined being with her, the less he could stand the thought of continuing his life with Emma. Divorce crossed his mind, but with it came financial loss and public shame. He didn't want to explain himself to anyone, and he didn't want to face Emma's inevitable fury. That's when his thoughts began to darken. The idea started as a shadow, quickly dismissed, but it returned again and again, more insistent each time. If Emma was gone, everything would be easier. No drawn-out legal battles, no lingering reminders of the years he had spent in bed. Just a clean break, a new life, and Lily waiting for him. He began to see opportunities everywhere. A late-night drive, a deserted stretch of road, a trip to somewhere far enough away that no one would hear. By now, the man Emma had known was gone. In his place was someone colder, someone who measured every interaction by what it could get him. He still played the role of the recovering husband in public, smiling when neighbors asked about his health, speaking softly to Emma when others were around. But in private, his mind was already moving toward a future without her. Lily, unaware of the full depth of his intentions, kept meeting him, kept accepting his gifts and attention. She had no idea she had become the reason for the dangerous thoughts he was nurturing. For Daniel, the decision felt inevitable. Emma's devotion had saved his life, but in his mind, that debt had long since been repaid. Now, he was ready to erase her entirely, convinced that with her gone, the next chapter of his life would finally begin. The night Daniel chose was warm and still, the kind of summer evening where the air seemed to cling to the skin. He had been patient, waiting for the right moment, rehearsing the steps in his mind until they felt inevitable. That day, he had been unusually attentive toward Emma, helping with small tasks, offering to take her for a drive to clear their heads. She accepted without hesitation, unaware that the kindness was only a layer over something far more sinister. They left just after sunset, the last light fading into a deep indigo sky. Daniel took the long road out of town, steering them onto winding rural roads lined with tall, whispering grass. The hum of the engine filled the silence between them. Emma leaned back in her seat, tired from work, but grateful for the rare chance to be alone together without distractions. She thought perhaps this was his way of reconnecting, of finding their rhythm again after months of distance. Daniel kept his eyes forward, his hands steady on the wheel. His mind was not on the scenery or the cool night air, but on the spot he had chosen days earlier. A quiet stretch of road with no streetlights, no houses, and no reason for anyone to pass by at that hour. Every turn brought them closer. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat, but his expression stayed calm, practiced. When they reached the place, he eased the car onto the gravel shoulder, claiming he'd heard a strange noise in the engine. Emma didn't question it. She had grown used to the way he handled small problems himself. She stayed in her seat, listening to the chirp of crickets, watching him step into the shadows at the edge of the road. He called her over to help with the flashlight, his voice level, almost casual. The attack was sudden and without warning. In the darkness, his movements were quick and decisive, leaving no chance for her to resist. The still night swallowed the sound, and when it was over, she lay motionless on the ground. Her life ended in the very place she had come, thinking they might find peace. Daniel stood over her for a moment, breathing hard, the reality of what he'd done settling like a heavy weight in the air. But he didn't allow himself to linger. He dragged her body into the tall grass, choosing a shallow ditch far enough from the road to avoid immediate notice. The soil was dry and loose, easy to disturb, and he worked quickly, covering her with dirt and broken stems. The job was crude, but in his mind it would be enough to keep her hidden until he could control the story. The moon hung low above him, pale and silent, casting just enough light for him to see his work before he returned to the car. The drive back was colder, quieter. He rolled down the windows to let the night air wash over him, forcing his breathing to slow, practicing the calm he would need to face anyone who asked where she had gone. By the time he reached town, his plan was already in motion. He would tell neighbors that Emma had decided to take a walk after their drive and hadn't returned. He would express concern, but not too much enough to seem worried without inviting suspicion. When he stepped inside the house, the emptiness didn't feel strange. He poured himself a glass of water, sat down at the kitchen table, and stared at the clock until he was sure the timeline made sense. Later that night he began making calls, asking friends if they had seen her, describing how she had seemed distracted lately, maybe even restless. He planted the seeds of a narrative in which her disappearance had nothing to do with him. In the days that followed, he played his part well. He joined search efforts, walking alongside neighbors and officers, calling her name into the fields he knew she would never answer from. He stood in front of cameras when local reporters came, telling them how much he hoped she would come home. His voice trembled in just the right way, his eyes glassy enough to suggest sleepless nights. All the while, Lily remained unaware of what had happened. Daniel kept their meetings limited, careful not to draw attention. But in his mind, the road ahead was clear. With Emma gone, the life he had imagined was finally within reach. The years of sickness, the nights spent helpless in bed, the sacrifices she had made, they were nothing now but memories he had buried along with her in that lonely patch of roadside earth. What Daniel didn't yet realize was that the very details he thought he had controlled, the timing, the location, the way he spoke about her absence, would soon begin to unravel. The cracks were already there, invisible for now, but widening with each step he took toward his new life. And when they broke open, they would expose everything. It didn't take long for small inconsistencies to surface. At first, Daniel's version of events sounded reasonable enough. He and Emma had gone for a drive. She'd seemed quiet, and later at home she had gone for a walk to clear her head. But the more he repeated the story, the more details shifted. Sometimes he said she left right after they returned. Other times he claimed she had been gone for hours before he noticed. Neighbors remembered seeing his car arrive much later than he claimed, and one even mentioned hearing it pass by twice that night, as if he had taken a detour before coming home. When police began asking questions, Daniel kept his answers short, playing the role of the grieving husband. He avoided eye contact for too long, or held it just a little too steadily when he did meet someone's gaze. Investigators noticed, and so they started digging deeper. Phone records were among the first cracks in his alibi. The night of Emma's disappearance, he had exchanged a series of late messages with Lily. The tone of the messages was casual on the surface, but their timing just after Emma was last seen raised suspicion. Security camera footage from a gas station on the edge of town showed Daniel alone in the car, purchasing a bottle of water less than an hour after he claimed Emma was still with him. The timestamp left no room for the version of events he had been offering. When confronted, he shrugged it off, saying Emma had decided to stay in the car. But the cashier didn't remember seeing anyone else. Then there was the matter of the receipts. Investigators found transactions for items linked to the crime: gloves, rope, and a flashlight bought just a week earlier. Daniel insisted they were for home repairs, but he couldn't produce any evidence that he had used them for such a purpose. Combined with the growing suspicion around his relationship with Lily, the picture forming was one of motive and preparation rather than coincidence. Lily herself became a reluctant witness. Initially, she denied any romantic involvement, claiming Daniel was just a friend. But under pressure, her account shifted. She admitted they had been seeing each other for months, and that he had spoken about feeling trapped in his marriage. She claimed she had no idea he was capable of violence, that she thought his frustrations were nothing more than words. Still, her testimony gave prosecutors a motive strong enough to pursue. The search for Emma's body intensified. Fields, wooded areas, and roadside ditches were combed by volunteers and police. After nearly 2 weeks, a local farmer reported a foul odor coming from a patch of overgrown grass along a back road. It was the same stretch Daniel had driven that night. The shallow grave was crude, just as he had left it, and the remains were identified as Emma's through dental records. Forensic examination revealed injuries that left little doubt about the cause of death. When confronted with the evidence, Daniel's composure finally began to crack. The interviews that once saw him calm and calculated became defensive and erratic. He contradicted himself under questioning, at one point insisting he had dropped Emma off somewhere safe, then claiming she had been alive when he last saw her on that road. Investigators knew they had enough to charge him, and soon after, he was arrested for murder. The trial drew intense local attention. In the courtroom, the story unfolded piece by piece. Emma's devotion during his recovery, the sudden change in his behavior after regaining his health, the secret relationship with Lily, and the careful planning that led to the night of her death. The prosecution painted Daniel as a man who saw his wife not as a partner, but as an obstacle, someone to be removed, so he could chase the life he thought he deserved. Lily testified reluctantly, her voice shaking as she admitted to accepting his gifts and attention, but insisting she had never asked him to harm Emma. The jury watched her closely, their focus returning again and again to Daniel, who sat at the defense table without his usual charm, his eyes fixed on some distant point as if refusing to acknowledge the weight of what was being said. It took less than 2 days of deliberation for the jury to return a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Daniel showed no visible reaction as the sentence was read, but the tension in the courtroom broke in a wave of whispers. He was given life in prison without the possibility of parole, a final and irreversible end to the freedom he had valued above everything else. Lily disappeared from public view soon after, distancing herself from the case that had shocked the community. Emma's funeral was held quietly, attended by those who remembered her as the woman who had sacrificed everything for the man who ultimately betrayed her. Her grave became a place where neighbors left flowers, not just in memory of her life, but as a silent protest against the cruelty that had taken it. In the end, Daniel's careful planning had unraveled under the smallest of truths. A shift in a story, a camera he hadn't noticed, a record he couldn't erase. He had traded years of loyalty and love for a fantasy that collapsed as soon as it was tested, and in that collapse, the world saw him not as the survivor he had once been, but as the man who destroyed the very person who had kept him alive.